I stood in our empty dining room at 8:47 p.m., staring at the anniversary cake I'd spent 3 days perfecting. 60 candles flickered in the darkness, while my husband of 40 years sat in some fancy restaurant downtown, laughing over wine with a woman younger than our daughter. The vanilla sponge cake with raspberry filling, Bob's favorite since our third anniversary, sat untouched on my grandmother's crystal cake stand. I'd hand-piped every rosette, mixed the buttercream from scratch, and carefully arranged 40 tiny sugar flowers around the base. Each delicate petal represented a year of our marriage, a year I'd believed we were building something unbreakable together. The dining room table stretched before me like an accusation. 2 place settings of our wedding china, the good silver we only used for special occasions. Cloth napkins I'd pressed that morning while humming our wedding song. Candles I'd lit at 7:30, expecting Bob to walk through the door with that sheepish grin he used to give me when work ran late. "Sorry, sweetheart, but I'm here now," he'd always say, and somehow that made everything okay. But it was almost 9 o'clock, and the candles had burned down to pools of wax. The beef tenderloin I'd marinated overnight sat cold in the kitchen, the roasted vegetables long since turned mushy. Even the wine, a bottle of Chianti from the same vineyard where we'd honeymooned in Tuscany, sat unopened, mocking me with its cheerful label. My phone buzzed for the 10th time that evening. Another text message I couldn't bring myself to read. I already knew what it said, what they all said. The same variation of lies he'd been feeding me for months. Running late with the Henderson account. Client emergency. Traffic is terrible. Empty words from a man who'd apparently forgotten that lies have expiration dates, and ours had expired the moment I saw them together at Romano's Bistro 3 hours ago. I hadn't meant to drive by. I'd been picking up the anniversary cake from the bakery when I spotted Bob's silver BMW in the parking lot. My heart had fluttered with excitement. Maybe he was picking up flowers, or perhaps he'd planned his own surprise for our evening. I'd almost pulled in to say hello when I saw them through the window. Bob and Jessica Chen, his 28-year-old colleague, sitting at the intimate corner table I'd suggested for our celebration. The same table where he'd proposed, 21 years into our marriage, renewing his vows with a diamond upgrade and promises of growing old together. But there was nothing old about the way Jessica threw back her head and laughed at something Bob said. Nothing familiar about how he reached across the table to touch her hand, the same gesture he used to reserve for me. She wore a stunning red dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and around her neck glittered a diamond pendant I'd never seen before. The kind of jewelry Bob used to buy me for birthdays and Christmases, before gift cards and forgotten occasions became his standard. I'd sat in my car for 15 minutes, watching my husband of 4 decades court another woman on what should have been our most cherished anniversary. 40 years of marriage, and this was how it ended. Not with a fight or harsh words, but with me discovering I'd become a stranger in my own love story. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Now, I stood alone in our dining room, surrounded by the remnants of a celebration that would never happen, finally understanding that some betrayals cut so deep they change the very air you breathe. For 6 months leading up to our 40th anniversary, I'd been planning what I believed would be the celebration of our lifetime. This wasn't just any milestone. It was 4 decades of building a life together, weathering storms, raising children, and proving that real love could endure anything. I wanted everything to be perfect, a testament to what we'd accomplished together. I started with a leather-bound journal where I documented every detail. October 15th would mark exactly 40 years since Bob nervously fumbled with my engagement ring in Central Park, promising me forever under the autumn maples. I researched the traditional gift for a 40th anniversary, the ruby, symbolizing passion and deep love, and smiled thinking about how appropriate that seemed. We'd kept our passion alive through sleepless nights with newborns, financial struggles in our 30s, teenagers who tested every boundary, and the recent transition into our golden years. The invitations became my obsession. I hand-wrote each one on cream-colored cardstock, using the calligraphy skills I'd learned in my 20s. Elena and Robert Martinez request the pleasure of your company as we celebrate 4 decades of love, laughter, and adventure. I addressed them to couples who'd stood beside us through everything: Ruth and Harold from next door, my sister Carmen and her husband Miguel, Bob's college roommate Mike, and his wife Sandra. People who'd watched us grow from young newlyweds into seasoned partners. The menu required weeks of research. I wanted to recreate our honeymoon in Tuscany, that magical week when we discovered tiny trattorias and fallen in love with authentic Italian cooking. I tracked down recipes for osso buco, the dish we'd shared on our first night in Florence, and practiced making fresh pasta until my hands could work the dough blindfolded. I even found a wine shop that imported from the exact vineyard where we'd picnicked among the olive groves, young and drunk on love and Chianti. The most ambitious part was altering my wedding dress. After 2 children and 40 years of living, the zipper wouldn't close, but I was determined. I found a seamstress who specialized in vintage gowns, and together we carefully let out seams and adjusted the fit. "This is beautiful," she said, admiring the delicate lace. "Your husband will fall in love all over again." I blushed like a teenager, imagining Bob's face when he saw me walking down our staircase in the dress I'd worn to promise him forever. Throughout all this planning, Bob seemed distracted with work, but that felt normal. He'd always been the provider, taking his responsibilities seriously. Some mornings I'd wake to find him already at his desk, coffee growing cold while he reviewed contracts and spreadsheets. "The Henderson account is keeping me busy," he'd explain when I brought him fresh coffee. "Big merger. Lots of moving parts." I'd massage his shoulders and remind him that retirement was just around the corner. "Soon you'll have all the time in the world for us," I'd whisper, kissing the top of his graying head. Every morning, I maintained our rituals. Coffee in bed at 7:15, prepared exactly how he liked it. 2 sugars, splash of cream. I'd ask about his day ahead, listen to his concerns about difficult clients, and remind him to eat lunch. "What would I do without you?" he'd say, and I'd glow with the satisfaction of being needed, being essential to someone's happiness. I believed we were solid, unshakable. After navigating Maria's teenage rebellion, David's college struggles, my mother's long illness, and Bob's heart scare 5 years ago, what challenge could possibly break us now? We were the couple other people envied, the ones who'd figured out how to keep love alive when so many others had given up. I was planning a celebration of everything we'd built together, never imagining I was actually planning a funeral for the life I thought we shared. 3 weeks before our anniversary, I decided to surprise Bob with lunch at his office. It was a Tuesday, and I'd spent the morning making his favorite chicken salad sandwiches with the special herb blend he loved. I even packed those expensive Italian cookies he always grabbed from the break room vending machine, thinking how pleased he'd be that I remembered such small details. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt longer than usual, my stomach fluttering with the same nervous excitement I'd felt as a newlywed, surprising him at work. Back then, his colleagues would tease him about having such a devoted wife, and Bob would beam with pride, introducing me to everyone as my better half. I hoped that same warmth would light up his face today. Mrs. Patterson, his longtime secretary, looked up from her desk when I approached. Something flickered across her expression, surprise, maybe discomfort, before she managed to smile. "Oh, Elena, how lovely to see you." But her voice carried an odd tension, like someone caught off guard by an unexpected visitor. I'd known Margaret Patterson for 15 years, had attended her daughter's wedding, brought casseroles when her husband was sick. This wasn't her usual warm greeting. "I brought Bob lunch," I said, lifting the carefully packed basket. "Is he available?" Margaret's eyes darted toward Bob's office, then back to me. "He's in a meeting with Jessica about the Henderson account. They've been working on it all morning." The way she said Jessica's name felt different somehow, weighted with meaning I couldn't quite grasp. Through the glass walls of Bob's office, I could see them bent over a conference table covered with papers and charts. But it wasn't the work that made my chest tighten. It was Jessica's hand resting casually on Bob's shoulder as she pointed to something on the documents. Her long, manicured fingers seemed perfectly at home there, and Bob didn't move away. In 40 years of marriage, I'd learned to read his body language like a familiar book. When uncomfortable, he'd stiffen, create distance. But his posture was relaxed, welcoming even. Jessica Chen had joined the firm 8 months ago, fresh from business school with impressive credentials and the kind of ambitious energy that made partners take notice. I'd met her briefly at the company Christmas party, where she'd been surrounded by admirers, her laugh carrying across the room like silver bells. She was everything I'd once been: young, vibrant, full of possibilities. Everything I sometimes felt I'd stopped being somewhere between diaper changes and parent-teacher conferences. When Bob noticed me watching through the glass, something shifted in his expression. He quickly moved away from Jessica and waved me in with what looked like forced enthusiasm. "Elena, what a nice surprise!" But there was something rehearsed about his tone, like an actor remembering his lines mid-performance. "Jessica, you remember my wife Elena?" Bob's introduction felt unnecessarily formal, lacking the pride that used to color his voice when he spoke about me. Jessica stood gracefully, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "Of course, Mrs. Martinez. Bob talks about you all the time." But her smile didn't reach her eyes, and something in her tone suggested the opposite might be true. When she looked at me, I felt evaluated, measured against some invisible standard. Her red silk blouse probably cost more than I spent on clothes in 6 months, and her confident posture spoke of a woman who'd never doubted her place in the world. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," I said, though the words felt hollow. I was interrupting something, but I wasn't sure what. "Not at all," Jessica replied smoothly. "We were just reviewing some projections. Bob's been so helpful with the client presentation." The way she said his name, Bob, not Mr. Martinez, felt intimate, familiar in a way that made my skin prickle. That night, Bob was quieter than usual at dinner. His responses to my questions about the Henderson account, shorter, more vague. When I mentioned seeing him and Jessica working so closely together, he barely looked up from his plate. "She's very dedicated," he said simply. "Reminds me of myself at that age." I wanted to ask what he meant by that, but something in his distant expression warned me away from the conversation. Instead, I cleared the dishes in silence, telling myself I was reading too much into a perfectly innocent working relationship. But as I washed our dinner plates that evening, I couldn't shake the image of Jessica's proprietary hand on my husband's shoulder, or the way Bob had seemed so comfortable in her orbit. For the first time in years, I felt like an outsider looking into a world where I didn't quite belong. The phone calls started 3 days after my visit to Bob's office, always during dinner when we'd traditionally shared the day's events over a home-cooked meal. The first time his phone buzzed, Bob glanced at the caller ID, and his entire demeanor shifted. "Sorry, honey, just work," he said, stepping onto our back porch with an apologetic smile. Through the kitchen window, I watched him pace across our deck, his voice animated in a way I hadn't heard in months. When he returned 20 minutes later, his salmon was cold, and I was clearing plates. "Everything okay?" I asked, reheating his dinner in the microwave. "Just client concerns," he said, but his eyes avoided mine. "You know how it is." Except I didn't know how it was, because in 38 years of marriage, work calls during dinner had been rare emergencies, not daily occurrences. Bob had always prided himself on leaving the office at the office, but suddenly our dining room felt like an interruption to his real life rather than the center of it. His laptop became a permanent fixture on our kitchen counter, open at all hours with spreadsheets and presentations I wasn't allowed to see. I'd bring him tea during his late-night work sessions, and he'd quickly minimize windows like a teenager hiding something inappropriate. "Just boring financial projections," he'd say. But his fingers moved too fast, his explanations too rehearsed. Our conversations shrank to functional exchanges. "Did you schedule the furnace inspection?" What time is Maria bringing the kids Sunday? The insurance company called about the car claim. The man who used to ask about my book club discussions and remember the names of my yoga classmates now treated me like a household manager rather than a life partner. When I tried to share news about Ruth's grandson getting into college or my excitement about the anniversary party, he'd nod absently while typing on his phone. "Are you listening to me?" I asked one evening after he'd missed my entire story about finding our wedding photographer's recent work online. "Of course I'm listening," he said, still staring at his screen. "You were talking about photos." That dismissive tone cut deeper than anger would have. It was the voice you'd use with a chattering child, not the woman you'd promised to cherish for better or worse. The weekend routine we'd maintained for decades began dissolving. Saturday morning farmers market visits became, "I need to catch up on work. You go ahead." Our Sunday afternoon drives through the countryside turned into him disappearing to the office for just a few hours that stretched until evening. Even our evening news ritual, where we'd comment on current events and share opinions, became him scrolling through his phone while the television provided background noise. I started cooking smaller portions, tired of throwing away untouched meals. Bob would text at 5:30 that he was grabbing dinner with colleagues, leaving me to eat alone at our kitchen island. The dining room table, once the heart of our family life, gathered dust under its protective cloth. When I tried to discuss our anniversary plans, hoping to rekindle his enthusiasm, he'd give me that patronizing smile I was learning to hate. "Whatever you think is best, Elena. You're good at this stuff." As if 40 years of shared memories were just stuff I was naturally equipped to handle, like laundry or grocery shopping. The cruelest part wasn't his absence. It was his presence without engagement. He'd sit across from me at breakfast, physically there, but emotionally unreachable, scrolling through messages that made him smile in ways I couldn't remember inspiring anymore. I felt like I was managing our life alone while he drifted further into some parallel existence where I wasn't welcome, wasn't even curious enough to warrant an explanation. I was becoming a ghost in my own marriage, invisible to the man who'd once promised I'd never have to face anything alone. The humiliation came wrapped in birthday cake and forced laughter at Ruth's 62nd birthday party. Her backyard was strung with fairy lights, filled with the same group of couples we'd been socializing with for over 2 decades. These were the people who'd watched our children grow up, who'd celebrated promotions and mourned losses together. I felt safe among them, surrounded by friends who knew our history. I was helping Ruth arrange dessert plates in her kitchen when I heard Bob's distinctive laugh carrying across the patio. Through the window, I saw him standing near the bar with his old college roommate Mike, both men holding beer bottles and wearing the relaxed expressions of longtime friends catching up. "40 years next month, huh?" Mike said, loud enough for nearby couples to hear. "That's quite an achievement these days." There was genuine admiration in his voice, the kind reserved for couples who'd beaten the odds in an era of disposable marriages. Bob took a long swig of his beer, and something shifted in his expression. Instead of the proud smile I expected, he wore the look of a man carrying a burden he was tired of hiding. "Yeah, well," he said, his voice carrying a bitter edge I'd never heard before. "Sometimes I think it's more like a long sentence, you know?" The words hit me like ice water. I gripped Ruth's granite countertop, my knuckles white against the dark surface, praying I'd misunderstood. Mike laughed uncomfortably, clearly not expecting that response. "Come on, Bob. Elena's a catch. You're lucky to have her." "Don't get me wrong," Bob continued, and I could see other couples subtly turning to listen. "Elena's a good woman, dependable. But sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd waited longer, you know? Married so young, never really got to explore my options." He gestured vaguely with his beer bottle. 24 years old when I proposed. What did I know about anything? The kitchen felt like it was spinning. My throat constricted as I processed what I was hearing. My husband of nearly 40 years discussing our marriage like a career mistake, reducing 4 decades of shared life to a case of premature commitment. The man who'd held my hand through labor pains, who'd cried when my father died, who'd promised me just 6 months ago that I was still the most beautiful woman in any room, was now describing our love story as a cautionary tale. Ruth appeared beside me, her face flushed with anger. "Elena, honey, don't listen to him. Men say stupid things when they drink." But Bob wasn't drunk. I'd seen him drunk, giggly and affectionate, telling everyone how much he loved his family. This was something else entirely. This was honesty he'd apparently been hiding, truth slipping out in what he thought was a safe space among friends. Sandra, Mike's wife, tried to redirect the conversation. "Well, you two seem happy enough. Elena was just telling us about your anniversary party plans." Bob's laugh was hollow. "Elena loves her parties. Always planning something, always trying to make everything perfect." The way he said perfect made it sound like a character flaw rather than a loving gesture. Later, when I gathered the courage to mention feeling hurt by his comments, Bob dismissed my pain with a wave of his hand. "It was just guy talk, Elena. Don't be so sensitive. You take everything so personally." His tone carried the same condescension he'd used to correct a child's misunderstanding. "But you called our marriage a sentence," I whispered, my voice breaking despite my efforts to stay calm. "I was making conversation," he said, already turning back to his laptop. "You're reading too much into it." But Ruth had heard every word, and the next morning she appeared at my door with coffee and the kind of gentle honesty only true friends can deliver. "Honey, that wasn't right what he said last night. That wasn't guy talk. That was cruel." For the first time in decades, I felt utterly alone in my own marriage, publicly diminished by the man who was supposed to cherish and protect me above all others. The morning of our 40th anniversary, I woke with the nervous excitement of a bride. Sunlight streamed through our bedroom curtains as I watched Bob sleep beside me, his graying hair tousled against the pillow. For a moment, he looked exactly like the young man who'd nervously proposed in Central Park, and I felt a surge of the old tenderness that had sustained us through 4 decades. I'd laid out his clothes the night before. The charcoal suit I'd bought him for Maria's wedding, the silk tie David had given him for Father's Day, the cufflinks that had belonged to his grandfather. Everything perfect for our celebration dinner at Romano's Bistro, the intimate restaurant where we'd had our first official date as an engaged couple. Downstairs, I prepared his coffee with extra care, adding just the right amount of cream and arranging fresh strawberries on his plate, exactly how he liked them. The morning felt sacred somehow, weighted with the significance of marking 4 decades together. I even hummed our wedding song while setting his place at the kitchen table. When Bob finally came downstairs at 8:30, he was already dressed in his best suit, and my heart fluttered with anticipation. "You look so handsome," I said, reaching up to adjust his tie with the familiar intimacy of a wife who'd been straightening her husband's collar for 40 years. "I can't wait for tonight." But instead of the warm smile I expected, Bob's expression was distant, almost apologetic. He avoided my eyes while I fussed with his appearance, his jaw set in that rigid way that usually meant he was preparing to deliver bad news. "Elena," he began, and something in his tone made my hands freeze on his tie. "I need to talk to you about tonight." My stomach dropped. "What about tonight?" He stepped back from my touch, creating physical distance that felt like an emotional chasm. "Something urgent came up with the Henderson account. There's a problem with the merger documents, and Jessica and I need to meet with the clients tonight to sort it out." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Tonight? Bob, it's our anniversary." "I know the timing is terrible," he said, but his tone was matter-of-fact rather than apologetic. "But this is a multi-million-dollar deal, Elena. I can't just walk away because it's inconvenient." "Inconvenient?" The word came out as a whisper. "Our 40th wedding anniversary is inconvenient?" Bob sighed, the sound filled with irritation rather than regret. "You're being dramatic. It's just dinner. We can celebrate this weekend when I don't have work emergencies." Just dinner. 4 decades of marriage reduced to just dinner. Something that could be rescheduled like a dental appointment or oil change. I stared at this man I'd loved since I was 22 years old, searching for any sign of the person who'd once moved heaven and earth to make me happy. "I've been planning this for months," I said, my voice barely audible. "I made reservations, bought a new dress, had my wedding dress altered." "And I appreciate all of that," Bob interrupted, glancing at his watch with the impatience of someone running late for something important. "But business doesn't stop for personal dates, Elena. You know that." Personal dates. Our anniversary had been demoted to a personal date, something separate from and less important than his real life. I watched him check his reflection in the hallway mirror, smoothing his hair and straightening the tie I'd just adjusted. He was preparing for an evening that mattered to him, just not an evening with me. "Will you at least be home late tonight?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. "Probably not. These client dinners can run pretty long, and Jessica and I will need to debrief afterward." Jessica and I. The phrase rolled off his tongue so naturally, as if they were the established unit, and I was the outsider trying to intrude on their important work. I followed him to the front door, watching him gather his briefcase and keys with the efficient movements of a man eager to begin his day elsewhere. When he kissed my cheek goodbye, it felt perfunctory, obligatory, the kind of gesture you'd give a roommate rather than the love of your life. "Have a good day, sweetheart," he said, already halfway out the door. "We'll celebrate this weekend, I promise." I stood in our doorway, watching his car disappear down our tree-lined street, and something inside me quietly shattered, not with anger or dramatic tears, but with the devastating silence of a heart finally accepting what it had been trying to deny for months. I was no longer the most important person in Bob's life. I wasn't even close. I stood in our empty house at 9:15 that night, surrounded by the remnants of a celebration that would never happen. The dining room looked like a crime scene of abandoned dreams. Wilted flowers drooping in crystal vases, congealed beef tenderloin concealing under aluminum foil, wine glasses that would never toast 4 decades of love. The anniversary cake sat in the center of it all, its 40 candles reduced to black wicks and pools of hardened wax. The silence was deafening. No clinking silverware, no gentle conversation, no Bob telling me how beautiful I looked in the navy dress I'd bought specifically for tonight. Just the hollow tick of our grandfather clock marking each empty minute, each breath I took alone in the house where we'd raised our children and built what I'd believed was an unbreakable life. I moved through the rooms like a sleepwalker, mechanically covering dishes with plastic wrap and storing untouched food in refrigerator containers. The ritualistic cleanup felt necessary, something to do with my hands while my mind struggled to process the magnitude of what had happened. 40 years of marriage, and I was spending our anniversary alone, discarded for a business dinner that felt more like a date with someone else. My phone sat silent on the kitchen counter. I'd called Maria at 7:30, desperate for the sound of a familiar voice, but she was dealing with her youngest son's fever and couldn't talk. "I'm sorry, Mom. Can I call you tomorrow?" she'd said, distracted by thermometers and medicine schedules. David was 3 hours behind in Seattle, probably still in meetings at his tech company. Ruth was visiting her sister in Jacksonville, posting photos of beach sunsets on Facebook, while I sat in my dark kitchen, forgotten by everyone who mattered. At 10 o'clock, I climbed the stairs to our bedroom and opened my closet. My wedding dress hung there like a ghost, carefully preserved in acid-free tissue paper, waiting for an occasion that would never come. I'd spent $200 having it altered, letting out seams and adjusting the fit so I could surprise Bob by wearing it tonight. The seamstress had said it looked beautiful, that Bob would fall in love all over again. Instead, he was falling in love with someone else entirely. I slipped out of my anniversary dress and pulled the wedding gown over my head, the ivory silk and delicate lace, still beautiful after 40 years. It fit perfectly now, thanks to the alterations I'd been so excited about just a week ago. But standing in front of our full-length mirror, I looked like a woman playing dress-up in someone else's memories. The young bride staring back from our wedding photos on the dresser looked so certain, so confident that love would be enough. She'd believed in forever with the absolute faith of a 22-year-old who'd never been betrayed. I touched the glass, tracing her radiant smile, and whispered, "I'm sorry I let you down." At midnight, I sat on our bedroom floor in my wedding dress, surrounded by photo albums spanning 4 decades. Our honeymoon in Tuscany, where Bob had promised we'd return for every anniversary. Our first apartment, where we'd eaten spaghetti off paper plates, and dreamed of the future we'd build together. Maria's first steps, David's high school graduation, family Christmases where we'd looked like the couple everyone envied. When had I become invisible to him? At what point had I transformed from the woman he couldn't live without into someone he could abandon without a second thought? I studied every photo, searching for the moment when his eyes stopped lighting up when he looked at me, when my presence became background noise in his life rather than its soundtrack. The house creaked around me, settling into the kind of deep quiet that only comes with true solitude. Tomorrow I would have to face friends who'd ask about our celebration, answer questions about a romantic evening that had never happened. I would have to smile and make excuses for a husband who'd chosen someone else over the promise he'd made at an altar 40 years ago. But tonight, I just sat in my wedding dress and mourned the death of everything I'd believed about love, loyalty, and the man I'd trusted with my heart since I was barely old enough to know what heartbreak meant. The next morning arrived gray and cold, matching the numbness that had settled in my chest overnight. I'd barely slept, the wedding dress hanging in my closet like an accusation every time I opened my eyes. Bob hadn't come home at all. His side of the bed remained untouched, his phone calls unanswered. At 7 a.m., I received a text. Stayed at Mike's after client dinner, home this afternoon, sorry about last night. Mike lived 20 minutes from downtown. Romano's Bistro was 5 minutes from Mike's house. The math didn't add up, but I was too emotionally exhausted to confront another lie. I decided to channel my nervous energy into something productive, something that would make me feel useful instead of abandoned. Bob's home office had been neglected for weeks while he spent longer hours at work, and I thought organizing his space might help me feel connected to him somehow, understand the pressures that had been pulling him away from us. The office smelled like his cologne and stale coffee, filled with the organized chaos of a man juggling multiple projects. I started with simple tasks: emptying the overflowing trash can, dusting his diploma frames, straightening the stack of business magazines he never seemed to finish reading. It felt good to move, to have a purpose beyond sitting in our empty house replaying last night's humiliation. I was vacuuming behind his desk when I noticed a piece of paper that had fallen between the wall and the heavy wooden furniture. Probably just a phone message or grocery list, but my obsessive need for order wouldn't let me leave it there. I moved the desk slightly and reached behind it, my fingers closing around what felt like an envelope. It was a credit card statement, folded and forgotten, dated from the previous month. I almost threw it away without reading it. Bob handled all our finances, and I'd never been the type to snoop through his papers. But something about the account name caught my eye. It wasn't our usual joint card, the one we used for household expenses and family purchases. This was an account I'd never seen before, in Bob's name only. My hands trembled as I unfolded the statement, and what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. Charge after charge at restaurants I'd never been to, expensive places downtown that I recognized from magazine reviews but had never experienced. Romano's Bistro appeared 3 times in the past month alone, the same restaurant where Bob claimed to be handling client emergencies, but had apparently been entertaining someone else entirely. The hotel charges made my stomach lurch. The Marriott downtown, the Hilton Garden Inn, even a weekend at the boutique hotel in Wine Country, where Bob had told me he was attending a business conference. All single-night stays, all during times when he'd told me he was working late or traveling for business. The dates aligned perfectly with his unexplained absences, his rushed phone calls, his increasing emotional distance. But it was the jewelry purchases that shattered what remained of my composure. Tiffany & Company. $3,200, dated 2 days ago. The same day Bob had claimed to be in budget meetings all afternoon, the same day I'd been at the bakery picking up our anniversary cake. K Jewelers, $850 the month before. Another Tiffany purchase for $400 in August, right around the time Bob had started those mysterious dinner meetings with Jessica. I'd been married to this man for 40 years, shared bank accounts and birthday celebrations, anniversary dinners and family vacations. I knew his spending habits better than my own. Bob was frugal with personal purchases, the kind of man who wore shoes until they had holes and drove cars until they wouldn't start. The last piece of jewelry he'd bought me was my anniversary band 5 years ago, and even then he'd agonized over the expense. My phone shook in my hands as I photographed every page of the statement, evidence of a secret life I'd never suspected. The man I'd trusted with everything, my heart, my future, my financial security, had been systematically deceiving me for months. Every client dinner had been a lie. Every business trip had been a romantic getaway with someone else. Every night he'd come home late, claiming exhaustion from work pressures. He'd actually been exhausted from living a double life. I sat in his leather desk chair, surrounded by the awards and family photos that decorated his office, and realized I didn't know my husband at all. The evidence of my erased existence was right there in black and white, a paper trail of betrayal hidden behind lies I'd been too trusting to question. For the first time in months, I felt completely awake. The numbness that had enveloped me since finding Bob's secret credit card statement was replaced by a crystalline clarity I hadn't experienced in years. It was as if I'd been living underwater and had suddenly broken through to the surface, gasping with the shock of being able to breathe again. I sat in Bob's office chair, the damning evidence spread across his desk like tarot cards, revealing an unwanted future. But instead of the crushing despair I'd expected, I felt something else entirely, a strange sense of liberation. The months of doubting my instincts, of telling myself I was being paranoid or oversensitive, had finally ended. I hadn't been losing my mind. My husband had been living a double life, and now I had proof. The photographs of the credit card statements glowed on my phone screen, each image a piece of a puzzle I was finally ready to solve. I opened a new note app and began creating a timeline, matching Bob's unexplained absences with the hotel charges, his mysterious dinner meetings with the expensive restaurant bills. The pattern was so obvious once I stopped making excuses for him. Every lie had been meticulously planned, every deception carefully crafted to keep me in the dark, while he built a new life with someone else. I thought about Jessica Chen, young, ambitious, unencumbered by 4 decades of history and compromise. She represented everything I'd once been and everything I'd apparently stopped being in Bob's eyes. But as I studied the evidence of their affair, I realized something profound. This wasn't about Jessica being better than me. This was about Bob choosing deception over honesty, selfishness over commitment, momentary excitement over enduring love. For 40 years, I'd defined myself through his lens. Elena Martinez, Bob's wife. Elena Martinez, Maria and David's mother. Elena Martinez, the woman who made perfect holiday dinners and remembered everyone's birthdays. I'd been so busy being what everyone needed that I'd forgotten who I was underneath all those roles. The woman Bob was discarding had been shaped by decades of putting everyone else's needs first, of making myself smaller so others could feel more important. But that woman, the real Elena, was still there underneath all the accumulated disappointments. She was the girl who'd graduated summa cum laude from college, who'd taught hundreds of students to love literature, who'd organized community fundraisers and run the school PTA with military precision. She was intelligent, capable, and far stronger than the diminished version of herself she'd become in her marriage. I walked to the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror with new eyes. Not the eyes of a woman seeking approval or validation, but the eyes of someone finally seeing clearly. Yes, I had wrinkles Bob apparently didn't find attractive anymore. Yes, my body had changed after carrying his children and weathering 40 years of life. But I was still here, still breathing, still capable of more than he'd allowed me to become. The afternoon sun streamed through our bedroom windows as I moved with purpose for the first time in months. I gathered every financial document I could find: bank statements, investment accounts, insurance policies, mortgage papers. Information I'd always left to Bob because he was better with numbers. But I'd managed household budgets for decades, had balanced checkbooks and planned family vacations. Numbers weren't mysterious when you stopped pretending they were someone else's responsibility. I opened my laptop and began researching lawyers who specialized in divorce cases involving long-term marriages and complex financial situations. I read articles about women starting over after 40, about dividing assets and protecting retirement accounts. Knowledge felt like armor against the uncertain future ahead. When Bob's key turned in the front door at 4 o'clock, I was sitting calmly at our kitchen table with a cup of tea and a notepad full of careful observations. He walked in carrying grocery store flowers and wearing the sheepish expression of a man who knew he'd disappointed his wife, but expected forgiveness anyway. "Elena, sweetheart, I'm so sorry about last night," he began, but I held up my hand to stop him. "How was your business dinner?" I asked with a smile that felt foreign on my face, not bitter or sarcastic, but genuinely curious. For the first time in our marriage, I was asking a question I already knew the answer to. Bob relaxed visibly, interpreting my calm demeanor as forgiveness. "It was productive. Long, but productive. Jessica sends her regards." "That's nice," I said, making a note on my pad. "I hope you enjoyed Romano's Bistro." I watched his face carefully, and there it was, the briefest flicker of panic before he recovered. "How did you know where we went?" "Lucky guess," I said, still smiling. "It's such a romantic little place." For the first time in months, I held all the cards, and I was finally ready to play them. Over the next 2 weeks, I transformed into someone I barely recognized, a woman with purpose, moving through each day with the quiet efficiency of a general planning a campaign. The difference was, my enemy had no idea a war had been declared. Bob continued his routine of lies and late nights, never suspecting that his devoted wife had become a detective, documenting every deception with methodical precision. My first stop was First National Bank, where I'd been a customer for 35 years. Sandra Morrison, the branch manager, greeted me with the warm familiarity of someone who'd processed decades of my deposits and withdrawals. "Elena, how lovely to see you. How's Bob?" "Actually, Sandra, I need to open an individual account," I said, sliding my identification across her polished desk. "Just something for my personal use." Sandra's practiced smile never wavered, though I caught the slight raise of her eyebrows. In all our years of banking together, Bob and I had maintained only joint accounts, a symbol of our unified financial life. "Of course. Are you thinking checking or savings?" "Both," I said firmly. "And I'd like to understand the process for transferring my teacher's pension into the new accounts." That afternoon, I walked out of the bank with my own debit card, my own checks with only my name printed in elegant script, and my own financial identity for the first time since I was 22 years old. The small plastic card felt revolutionary in my wallet, a tangible symbol of independence I'd forgotten I was capable of claiming. The divorce attorney's office was located in a sleek downtown building I'd driven past countless times but never entered. Margaret Chen, no relation to Jessica, I'd made sure, was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd shepherded many wives through the wreckage of broken marriages. 40 years is a significant marriage length, she said, reviewing the financial documents I'd gathered. New Mexico is a community property state, which works in your favor. Everything acquired during the marriage is generally split 50-50. I absorbed this information like a sponge, taking careful notes on legal terminology that had never applied to my life before. Marital assets, spousal support, equitable distribution, words that transformed my love story into a business transaction, reducing 4 decades to property divisions and support calculations. "I need you to understand," Margaret explained gently, "that once you file, there's no going back to the way things were. Even if you ultimately reconcile, the trust dynamic changes permanently." "There's nothing left to go back to," I said, with a certainty that surprised us both. Every evening while Bob worked late with Jessica, I worked too. I researched property values for our house, calculated the worth of Bob's retirement accounts, and documented every asset we'd accumulated together. I photographed his trophy collection from his golf tournaments, cataloged the antique furniture we'd inherited from his grandmother, and created spreadsheets that would have made my old accounting students proud. My sister Carmen called from Phoenix during one of these research sessions. "Elena, you sound different," she said, her voice filled with concern. "Stronger somehow." What's going on? I'd always protected Carmen from the details of my marriage struggles, not wanting to burden her with problems I thought I could solve alone. But sitting in my quiet kitchen with legal documents spread across the table, I finally told her everything. The months of lies, the credit card statements, the anniversary dinner that became a date with someone else. Mija, Carmen whispered, using our childhood endearment. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I could have helped. I needed to figure this out myself first, I said, and realized it was true. For months, I'd felt like a victim of circumstances beyond my control. But planning my own future, making my own decisions, had returned something essential I'd lost: my sense of agency. The hardest part wasn't the legal research or financial planning. It was maintaining the performance of normalcy when Bob came home each night. I continued making his coffee exactly how he liked it, asking about his day, playing the role of the devoted wife while secretly preparing to dismantle the life we'd built together. But each morning when I looked in the bathroom mirror, I saw someone I'd forgotten existed. A woman capable of taking care of herself, worthy of better treatment than she'd been accepting, strong enough to choose an unknown future over a familiar lie. For the first time in years, I felt like myself again. Bob's confidence began showing hairline cracks like a foundation settling under pressure. It started with small things: a stutter when I asked about his day, the way his hand would hover over his phone when it buzzed during dinner, the slight widening of his eyes when I mentioned his work schedule with too much specificity. The first real crack came on a Thursday evening when his office phone rang during what should have been our quiet dinner time. Bob had been telling me about a difficult client presentation he was preparing, his usual vague explanation for working late with Jessica. But when his phone lit up with Robert Martinez CPA on the caller ID, I answered before he could stop me. "Martinez residence, Elena speaking," I said pleasantly, watching Bob's face drain of color across our kitchen table. "Oh, hello, Elena. This is Jim Harwell from the office. I was hoping to catch Bob before he headed home." "Actually, Jim, Bob's right here having dinner. He was just telling me about the Henderson account presentation you have tomorrow." I smiled at Bob while speaking, enjoying the panic flickering across his features. "Henderson account?" Jim sounded genuinely confused. "Elena, that account wrapped up 3 weeks ago. We closed it out on the 15th. I was actually calling about the Morrison audit. We need Bob in early tomorrow to review some discrepancies." The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Bob's carefully constructed lie had just exploded in real time, witnessed by both his wife and his boss. I could practically see his mind racing, searching for an explanation that would make sense of this contradiction. "Oh, of course," I said smoothly into the phone. "Bob mentioned the Morrison situation. He's been working so hard on multiple accounts. Sometimes they blur together. I'll make sure he gets the message about tomorrow." After I hung up, Bob sat frozen at our table, his dinner growing cold while he processed what had just happened. For months, he'd been confident in his deceptions, secure in my apparent naivety. But now he knew that I knew, and the comfortable dynamic of our marriage had shifted irreversibly. "Elena," he began carefully, "about what Jim said." "About the Henderson account being closed 3 weeks ago?" I asked, my voice maintaining the same pleasant tone I'd used on the phone. "The same account you've been using to explain all those late nights with Jessica?" Bob's jaw worked silently, caught between continuing the lie and admitting the truth. The man who'd been so smooth in his deceptions suddenly looked like a child caught stealing cookies, uncertain which approach would minimize his punishment. "It's not what you think," he said finally, the classic response of someone who knew exactly what it looked like and couldn't deny it. "What I think," I said, cutting a precise bite of my chicken, "is that you've been lying to me for months. What I think is that your business dinners with Jessica aren't about business at all." I took a sip of wine, letting the implications settle between us. "What I think is that you've forgotten I'm not actually stupid, Robert." The use of his full name, something I only did when seriously angry, made him flinch. But more than that, it was my tone that unnerved him. Not the tearful confrontation of a betrayed wife, but the calm assessment of a woman who held information he didn't know she possessed. His phone buzzed with a text message, and for the first time in months, he didn't immediately check it. Instead, he looked at me with something approaching wariness, as if seeing me clearly for the first time in years. "We need to talk about this properly," Bob said, reaching for his usual position of control in our relationship. "Yes," I agreed, clearing our plates with efficient movements. "We do, but not tonight. Tonight you have that Morrison audit to prepare for, and I have some reading to do." The reading in question was the divorce documentation Margaret Chen had given me, but Bob didn't need to know that yet. I watched him retreat to his office, like a general who'd just realized his enemy had better intelligence than he'd assumed. For 40 years, Bob had held all the power in our marriage through his control of information, finances, and my emotional dependence on his approval. But power, I was learning, could shift as quickly as the foundation it was built on. And our foundation was crumbling beneath his feet, while I stood on solid ground for the first time in years. I chose Giovanni's for our final conversation, the same intimate Italian restaurant where Bob had proposed 41 years ago, down on one knee beside our corner table while violinists played our favorite song. The irony felt perfect, bringing our marriage full circle in the place where it had begun, with promises that had apparently expired somewhere along the way. Bob arrived 5 minutes late, slightly out of breath and carrying the same wilted grocery store flowers he'd been bringing home as peace offerings for weeks. He looked relieved when he saw me sitting calmly at our old table, probably interpreting this dinner invitation as my attempt at reconciliation. After 2 weeks of careful conversations and mounting tension, he likely thought his devoted wife was ready to return to their comfortable routine of lies and willful ignorance. "You look beautiful tonight," he said, settling into the chair across from me with the confident smile of a man who believed he'd weathered the storm. I wore the navy dress I'd bought for our anniversary, the same one I'd sat alone in 2 weeks ago while he celebrated with someone else. "Thank you," I replied, pouring wine from the bottle I'd ordered ahead of time, Chianti from the same vineyard where we'd honeymooned in Tuscany. "I thought it was time we had a proper celebration." Bob relaxed visibly, reaching across the table to take my hand in the gesture that had once made my heart flutter, but now felt rehearsed, empty. "Elena, I know these past few weeks have been difficult. Work has been so stressful, and I know I haven't been the husband you deserve." I let him hold my hand while I studied his face, the laugh lines earned through decades of shared joy, the gray at his temples that I'd found distinguished, the brown eyes that had once looked at me like I was the most fascinating woman in any room. When had those eyes learned to lie so convincingly? "Tell me about the Henderson account," I said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. Bob's thumb stopped its gentle stroking across my knuckles. "What about it?" "Well, you've been working so hard on it with Jessica. All those late meetings, those client dinners." I smiled the patient smile of a wife who'd been listening to work stories for 40 years. "I'd love to hear how it's progressing." "It's complex," Bob said carefully, his confidence wavering as he tried to read my expression. "Lots of moving parts." "I'm sure," I agreed, reaching into my purse with my free hand. "Complex enough to require dinner meetings at Romano's Bistro 3 times last month alone." I placed the copied credit card statements on the white tablecloth between us, watching Bob's face transform from confusion to recognition to naked fear. The color drained from his cheeks as he stared at the evidence of his double life, all those carefully hidden charges now exposed under the soft lighting of our romantic restaurant. "Elena, I can explain," he began, but I held up my hand to stop him. "The Henderson account closed 3 weeks ago," I continued in the same conversational tone. "Jim Harwell told me so when he called about the Morrison audit, the same night you were supposedly preparing a Henderson presentation." I turned the pages methodically, like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. "But here are charges for the Marriott downtown on that exact date. Room 412 to be specific." Bob's hand tightened around mine, but whether from desperation or habit, I couldn't tell. "Elena, please let me explain what happened." "What happened," I said, gently pulling my hand from his grasp, "is that you've been having an affair with Jessica Chen for months. What happened is that you spent our 40th anniversary in bed with a woman younger than our daughter, while I sat alone in our dining room with the cake I'd made to celebrate our marriage. The restaurant noise seemed to fade around us, the clatter of dishes and murmur of other diners becoming distant background to the destruction of everything we'd built together. Bob looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of his exposed lies. The jewelry purchases are particularly interesting, I continued, turning to the Tiffany receipts. $3,000 2 days before our anniversary. I assume that necklace Jessica was wearing at Romano's was your gift. I'd done my research, had even driven by the restaurant to confirm my suspicions about their public displays of affection. Elena, please. I've already filed for divorce, I said simply, watching 40 years of shared history rearrange itself around those 5 words. The papers will be served tomorrow morning at your office. I thought you deserved to hear it from me first, in the place where you promised to love me forever. The silence stretched between us like the years we'd never get back, filled with everything we'd lost and everything that could never be repaired. Bob sat frozen, perhaps finally understanding that his comfortable world of lies and assumptions had crumbled completely. "We can work through this," he said finally, his voice breaking. "Elena, we can fix this." I stood from the table, leaving the wine unfinished and the evidence scattered between us like the remnants of our marriage. Some things, Robert, are too broken to fix, and some people are too tired of pretending they're not. What Bob didn't know, what he couldn't have known while he was busy playing house with his young colleague, was that Jessica Chen had been playing a much deeper game than either of us had imagined. The truth came out 3 days after I served him divorce papers, delivered through a phone call from Margaret Chen that changed everything I thought I understood about the situation. "Elena, you need to sit down," my attorney said, her usually composed voice carrying an edge of excitement I'd never heard before. "We've received some very interesting information from Bob's firm." I was in my new downtown apartment, still surrounded by moving boxes and the unfamiliar silence of living alone for the first time in 4 decades. Through my windows, I could see the building where Bob worked, where his carefully constructed double life was apparently imploding in ways I'd never anticipated. "The partners at Henderson & Associates want to meet with you," Margaret continued. "It seems Jessica Chen has been very busy documenting her relationship with your husband, but not for the reasons we initially thought." The meeting took place in a conference room that smelled of leather and expensive cologne, filled with serious men in expensive suits who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. James Henderson himself, the senior partner whose name graced the building, sat at the head of the polished table with an expression of barely contained fury. "Mrs. Martinez," he began, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to control, "we owe you an apology. We've discovered that your husband has been engaged in activities that violate not only his marriage vows, but also his fiduciary responsibilities to this firm." The story they unfolded was more twisted than anything I could have imagined. Jessica Chen, it turned out, had been systematically documenting Bob's behavior from the beginning of their affair, not out of love or romantic devotion, but as insurance against potential sexual harassment claims and evidence of his financial improprieties. "She came to us 2 weeks ago with detailed records," explained Patricia Williams, the firm's head of human resources, sliding a thick folder across the table. "Credit card statements showing personal expenses charged to company accounts, hotel receipts for trips that were never approved for business purposes, restaurant charges that don't match any legitimate client entertainment." I stared at copies of the same credit card statements I'd found in Bob's office, but now I saw them through different eyes. The expensive dinners hadn't just been romantic dates. They'd been charged to company accounts as fake business expenses. The hotel stays hadn't just been secret rendezvous. They'd been fraudulent business trips that Bob had never actually taken for work purposes. "Your husband has been embezzling from this firm for months," Henderson said bluntly, "using company credit cards for personal expenses, filing false travel reimbursement claims, even billing personal time as client hours. We estimate the total amount at over $60,000. But Jessica's documentation went deeper than financial fraud. She'd saved text messages where Bob disparaged other colleagues, emails where he made inappropriate comments about female clients, and recorded conversations where he discussed confidential client information in violation of attorney-client privilege. Why would she do this? I asked, still trying to process the magnitude of what I was hearing. Patricia Williams exchanged glances with the partners before answering. Miss Chen is 28 years old and very ambitious. She saw an opportunity to position herself favorably with senior management by exposing misconduct. She also wanted protection against any potential retaliation if your husband became vindictive when she ended their relationship. The beautiful young woman I'd been so jealous of had been playing chess while Bob thought they were playing house. She'd seduced him not out of love, but as a calculated career move, gathering evidence that would simultaneously advance her position at the firm and destroy his. We've terminated Mr. Martinez effective immediately, Henderson continued. We're also pursuing criminal charges for embezzlement and considering civil action to recover the stolen funds. I sat in stunned silence, realizing that Bob wasn't just losing his wife and half his assets in the divorce. He was facing criminal prosecution, professional disgrace, and financial ruin. The man who'd discarded me for a younger woman had been systematically destroyed by that same woman who'd apparently seen him as nothing more than a stepping stone to her own success. There's more, Margaret Chen added quietly. Jessica has agreed to testify in your divorce proceedings about Bob's asset hiding and financial deception. She has evidence of undisclosed accounts and investments that significantly increased your settlement amount. The woman Bob had chosen over me had ultimately chosen herself over both of us. In trying to trade his devoted wife for an exciting new model, he'd selected someone infinitely more ruthless than he'd ever been. Jessica hadn't just stolen him from me. She'd stolen his entire future and handed it to me on a silver platter. Sometimes the universe has a sense of irony so perfect, it feels like divine intervention. 3 months after the divorce papers were finalized, Maria knocked on the door of my downtown apartment, carrying a bottle of wine and the determined expression she'd inherited from me. I was expecting her. We'd been talking more in the past few months than we had in years, my new independence somehow making me more available to my children rather than less. "Mom, this place is incredible," she said, settling into the cream-colored sofa I'd chosen without consulting anyone else's preferences for the first time in decades. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sparkled below us, alive with possibilities I was still learning to embrace. My apartment was a deliberate contradiction to the house I'd shared with Bob, modern instead of traditional, minimalist instead of cluttered with 40 years of accumulated compromises. Every piece of furniture had been chosen because I loved it, not because it matched someone else's vision of what our life should look like. The abstract paintings on the walls were bold and colorful, the kind Bob had always dismissed as too busy. I'd fallen in love with them the moment I saw them at a local gallery opening Ruth had dragged me to. "I'm proud of you," Maria said, curling up with her wine like she used to do during college visits home. "You seem like yourself again. I didn't realize how diminished you'd become until I saw you starting to glow again." It was true. People kept commenting on the change. The librarians at my volunteer job, the students in my community center cooking classes, even my hairstylist who'd convinced me to try a shorter, more modern cut that framed my face instead of hiding it. I felt more like the woman I'd been at 22 than I had in decades, as if removing Bob from my life had allowed me to remember who I was underneath all those years of accommodation. "David called me last night," Maria said carefully, swirling her wine with the deliberate casualness that meant she was about to deliver news I might not want to hear. "Oh?" I kept my voice neutral, though my stomach tightened slightly. David had been calling more frequently since the divorce, our relationship slowly rebuilding, now that I wasn't constantly making excuses for his father's behavior or mediating between them. "He says Dad keeps asking him to talk to you, to maybe arrange a meeting, see if you'd be willing to discuss reconciliation." Maria watched my face carefully as she spoke. "Dad apparently thinks you just needed time to cool off, that maybe now you'd be ready to work things out." I laughed. Not bitterly, but with genuine amusement at Bob's fundamental misunderstanding of everything that had happened. "Your father thinks I left because I was angry. Weren't you?" I considered the question seriously, looking out at the city lights that had become my evening meditation. I was angry, yes, but mostly I was tired. Tired of being invisible, tired of making excuses, tired of pretending that being treated poorly was the same thing as being loved. Maria nodded thoughtfully. At 38, she'd learned to navigate her own marriage with more wisdom than I'd possessed at her age, partly because she'd watched my mistakes, and partly because her generation expected partnership rather than just companionship. "He's not doing well," she said gently. "The criminal charges, losing his job, having to sell the house. David says he looks 10 years older and keeps talking about how he threw away the best thing in his life." There was a time when hearing about Bob's suffering would have shattered my resolve, would have sent me running back to comfort the man who'd once been my whole world. But that woman, the one who'd defined herself entirely through other people's needs, felt like someone I'd known in another lifetime. "I'm sorry he's struggling," I said, and meant it. "I don't wish him harm, Maria, but his pain doesn't create an obligation for me to sacrifice my happiness again." "So no chance of reconciliation?" There was relief in her voice, rather than disappointment. "Sweetheart, you can't reconcile with someone who never truly saw you in the first place." I reached over and squeezed her hand. "Your father fell in love with an idea of who I was, the devoted wife, the selfless mother, the woman who would always put everyone else first. When I stopped being that person, when I started choosing myself, he couldn't even recognize me anymore." Maria was quiet for a long moment, processing what I'd said. "You're right. Even now he talks about getting the old Elena back. He doesn't seem to understand that the old Elena was disappearing long before Jessica came along." We sat in comfortable silence, watching the city pulse with life below us. For the first time in years, my relationship with my daughter felt authentic rather than performative, built on who I actually was rather than who I thought I should be. "I like this version of you better," Maria said finally. "You're still my mom, but you're Elena. You have opinions about art now, and you laugh more, and you don't spend every conversation asking about everyone else's problems without mentioning your own." She was right. For 40 years, I'd been so busy being everyone else's support system that I'd forgotten I deserved support too. Now, finally, I was learning to be my own foundation instead of building my life on ground that could shift beneath my feet. "Your father made his choice," I told Maria. "Now, I've made mine." 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I stood in the community center's bright kitchen, teaching my Thursday evening cooking class, watching 12 eager students attempt to master the art of homemade pasta. The familiar rhythm of kneading dough and the gentle chaos of flour-dusted countertops filled me with the same satisfaction I'd once found in teaching literature, but with an added layer of joy I was still learning to recognize as my own contentment. "Mrs. Martinez," called out Jennifer, a young mother juggling night classes and 2 toddlers, "why isn't my dough coming together like yours?" I moved to her station, my hands guiding hers through the motion of working the flour and eggs into silk. Teaching had always been my calling, but now I was doing it on my terms, sharing skills I'd perfected over decades rather than curricula determined by others. These students came to me willingly, hungry for knowledge I was excited to share, and every Thursday evening felt like a gift I was giving to both them and myself. After class, I walked the 6 blocks to the downtown library where I volunteered 3 evenings a week, helping adult learners navigate computer basics and job applications. The work felt meaningful in ways I'd forgotten were possible, each small success story reminding me that starting over wasn't just possible at any age. Sometimes it was necessary for survival. Mrs. Chen, Margaret's elderly aunt who'd become a regular at the library, waved me over to her usual computer station. "Elena, dear, I finally finished my online application for citizenship classes. Could you help me print it?" "Of course," I said, settling beside her with the patience that had made me a good teacher and, I was learning, made me an even better volunteer. "You've worked so hard on this, Mrs. Chen. Your English has improved tremendously." She beamed at the compliment, then studied my face with the shrewd assessment of someone who'd lived through enough change to recognize transformation in others. "You look happy, Elena. Different from when you first started volunteering here." She was right. The woman who'd begun volunteering 6 months ago had been running from the wreckage of her marriage, seeking distraction from the pain of Bob's betrayal. But somewhere between teaching pasta techniques and helping people navigate computer screens, I'd stopped running from my old life and started building a new one. Last week, a young woman named Sarah had approached me after cooking class, her eyes bright with curiosity and something that looked like desperate hope. "Mrs. Martinez, can I ask you something personal?" I'd nodded, recognizing the look of someone standing at her own crossroads. "How did you find the courage to start over at your age? I mean, you left a 40-year marriage and completely rebuilt your life. I'm 35, and I'm terrified to leave a relationship that's only been toxic for 3 years." I'd thought about her question while walking home through the city streets I'd learned to navigate like a native, past restaurants I'd discovered on my own, and galleries where I'd begun to trust my own artistic taste. The answer had come to me gradually, like morning light slowly illuminating a familiar room. "Sweetheart," I'd told her, "I didn't start over. I finally stopped pretending to be less than I am." Tonight, those words echoed in my mind as I stood on my apartment balcony, looking out at the city that had become my new home. Bob was probably sitting in his small rental apartment across town, perhaps scrolling through old photos and wondering how everything had gone wrong. Jessica had moved to Chicago after her promotion, having successfully leveraged her documentation of Bob's misconduct into a senior position at a larger firm. But I was here, in this moment, surrounded by a life I'd built from the ground up at 64 years old. Tomorrow I would teach another cooking class, help more people navigate the digital world, maybe browse the art gallery that had started sending me invitations to new exhibitions. The woman in the wedding dress, who'd sat crying on her bedroom floor 6 months ago, felt like someone I'd known in another lifetime. Someone I was grateful to have been but no longer needed to be. She'd taught me about endurance and compromise and the dangers of losing yourself in someone else's dreams. This woman, Elena Martinez, single, independent, finally comfortable in her own skin, was teaching me about possibility and courage and the profound joy of choosing yourself after decades of choosing everyone else first. Sometimes the best anniversary gift you can give yourself is the courage to write a new chapter. And sometimes that chapter turns out to be just the beginning of the story you were always meant to tell. The city lights sparkled below me like stars I was finally brave enough to reach for, and for the first time in 40 years, the future felt entirely, beautifully mine.